This is a sermon from St. Paul's Church, Brookfield, Connecticut, transforming lives through Jesus. For more information, go to www.stpaulsbrookfield.com.
Some of you may have never seen me before, but we've been part of St. Paul's for the last 2.5, almost 3 years. But we attend the 8 o'clock service, and I've always wondered how the other half lived in St. Gracie. Now I know. My wife and I served as missionaries for many years in Japan, Singapore, and elsewhere. But I remember so well one Christmas some time ago when my wife Lindy and I were serving as new missionaries in northern Japan at that time. We worked, we came to a small town called Kuroishi, and that name means Black Rock, town of about 40,000 people in northern Honshu. We were newly minted missionaries. Our job was to try and start a church, plant a church in that community. And as far as we knew at that time, there were no believers, there was no church in that population of 40,000, about the size of Newtown. At any rate, after we had been there a while, it came time for our first Christmas. And we spent some time in the morning with our boys. We had 2 at that time. One more was added later. But we got together and we were singing and opening presents and trying to have Christmas as best we could. And then we decided to go into town and have lunch. I remember as we drove up and parked, just walking up and down the streets and looking into the shops, and suddenly dawned on me that there was no visible sign at that point of Christmas. No decorations, no music. And I was humming away, in my heart with joy to the world, the Lord has come, joy to the world. And yet, as I looked and saw those faces, they were just going about business as usual. I realized they couldn't sing joy to the world. Why? Because they simply didn't know the words. They'd never heard the message. I think, at Christmas, it's important for us to spend time with family and friends as part of a fellowship like St. Paul's, and to remember, the fact that Jesus did come and why he came. But I think it's important also for us to remember for whom he came. The angels, when they spoke to the shepherds in the hills at the birth of Christ, they said, we have some really, really good news for you. And this is exciting, life-changing news. And this news that we bring, good tidings of a Savior being born, it's for all people. Obviously, Israel was foremost in their thinking, but beyond that, Luke makes it clear in his gospel that the gospel was intended, this good news, the song was to be sung by people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, every ethnic group. That was the heart of God. For God so loved the world, Jesus reminded us that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. I think, when we look at our world today, it's estimated there's 7.7 billion people. Can you relate to 7 billion plus people? And yet each and every one of these is loved by God. But the sad reality is that in this world of 7.7 billion people, roughly 1/3 are living in places or situations where that song that we sing, joy to the world, the Lord has come, that's not available to them. They don't have Christians, neighbors living nearby. They don't have lively churches in their communities that could connect with them culturally or linguistically. They're living in places where Christ is not known and the church is not near. And I think it's important at Christmas then we think not only of ourselves and what we're familiar with and love, but remember that God really loves the whole world. The Apostle Paul writes this reminder to the church in Rome. He says, well, how in the world are people who don't know the words to the song that we sing, how are they going to hear? How are they going to know? How are they ever going to believe? And he wrote this in Romans chapter 10, verses 14 to 15. He says, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they've not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. God's desire is that people around the globe, in those places where he's not known yet, and where there aren't churches, that they have that opportunity to hear. And how's that going to happen? Well, God never intended the spread of the gospel to be the work of a few super saints, special people, while the rest of us sit on the benches and occasionally applaud and cheer them on. No, God intended the spread of the gospel or world evangelization to be the work to be part of a partnership between those who go and those who send. And you say, well, what does that mean? Churches send and people go, but what does that look like in real life? What would that mean for St. Paul's today? Well, we get a model of what God, I believe, intends for every local church to look like when we're thinking of God's global heart for the world. And we find this in the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. Philippi at that time was a bustling city. It was a seaport, a commercial center. It had a medical school, and it maybe even Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and Acts, perhaps he was alumni of that medical school in Philippi. But whatever, Paul writes to this church. Why? Because they were supporting him. They wanted to be a part of his ministry and his missionary service. And so they were giving and praying and doing various things. And in the letter to the church in Philippi, we see illustrations of what it means to be a partner in the gospel, to be a part of God's global purpose. And I think that's what he wants for every one of us here. What he wants for St. Paul's as a whole, to be a partner in the gospel. What does that look like? Well, it begins and starts with this foundational reality and truth. In verse 27 of chapter 1, Paul writes this. He says, whatever happens, he says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Now, if I were to ask you, what's the biggest contribution you can make to global evangelization, to taking the gospel to all those places where Christ is not known and the church is not near? What would be the most important, the biggest thing that you could do? How would you respond? Well, maybe you say, well, I guess I'd write a few more checks, or perhaps I would pray a little more or get more information. And that's all good and well and important. But he says it begins with something so fundamental that we as individual Christians can make a difference in serving God's global purposes simply by the way we live. He says, live a life worthy of the gospel. The word worthy there means to have equal weight, to be the same as. In other words, what do we claim that Christ can do and who he is and how he can change our lives and so forth? And yet, what do our daily actions or attitudes look like? And if there's a dissonance between those two, that can put people off. And so who we are and how we act and how we live can either attract people to Christ or possibly even drive them away. That's a sobering thought. Some years ago, my wife and I were in the Philippines, and we were in the southern Philippines on the island of Mindanao. And the largest ethnic group there are called the Maguindanao, and there are about 4 million Muslims, Maguindanao, in the southern Philippines. And I was talking to one of our colleagues and workers, and I said, what do you see as the biggest hindrance, the biggest problem in trying to share Christ with these people, the Maguindanao? He said the problem is that they have an image in their mind of what a Christian looks like. And that image, that representation, that stereotype isn't very attractive. I said, what is that? He said, when an average Muslim in the Philippines and many other parts of the world thinks of a Christian, they think of pork-eating, beer-guzzling, loose-living idolater. That's not exactly the poster child for Christianity, is it? That would attract anybody. So the biggest hindrance to the gospel at times simply can be the disconnect between what we claim and what we do. So he says, if you want to be a partner and help God's global purposes, then it begins with how we live, our actions, to live a life worthy of the gospel. But he went on, Paul did, and he said there's another way in which this church in Philippi was truly being a partner in the gospel. He was so thankful that they were partners in the gospel, and he thanks them for that. He's so grateful for their support. But it comes out this way in verse 19 in chapter 1. Paul reminds these friends, he says in Philippi, "Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance." To me, this is amazing. Here's Paul basically at this time in Rome, 800 miles away from the church in Philippi. And yet they can touch his life. They can help him in a very tangible, powerful way. And you say, how's that possible? They couldn't Zoom, they couldn't send emails, they couldn't tweet back and forth or whatever. And there they were, miles and miles apart. And yet they could touch his life. And how does that happen? He says, through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. You see, God uses means as part of his way of working in people's lives and even in the affairs of nations. He doesn't tend to work apart from means, and prayer is an important part of that. And what Paul is reminding them is as they prayed, God's resources would be released, and as a result, Paul's circumstances would be changed. As they prayed, God would provide help. Sometimes we think of prayer as sort of, a prelude or a sort of a warm-up to the main event, to what's really important, to prayer, service, ministry, or action. But God would remind us that prayer isn't just a prelude, it is ministry. Prayer is service. Prayer is ministry. There's a lot of things you can do. There's nothing more important than you can do to pray for God's message as it goes out in the world that'll make a difference, and also his and prayer for his messengers. This came home to my wife and I, Lindy, in the early part of our ministry and as missionaries in northern Japan. We came into this town of Kuroishi that I mentioned earlier. And for several months, I was trying everything in the world that I knew how to do. I'd been to seminary and all the rest and had courses in missiology and cross-cultural communication and, how to plant churches and all the rest, but I was getting nowhere. I tried everything in the world, nothing was working. And so finally, out of desperation, I said, well, when all else fails, maybe I'll pray. And so I wrote a letter home to our supporting churches and friends, and I said, look, we're stuck. We're getting nowhere. Would you pray with us that God would open a door for the word in that town of 40,000 people and break into the hearts and lives of some people, that we might see a church born? I had no idea what was going to happen, but a few days later, I had to go and have some business cards made. And in Japan, without a business card, they're called a meishi. You're a non-entity. You're nobody, so you got to have these things. And everybody's passing them out like crazy. So anyway, I walked into this print shop, and I said, I'd like some business cards made. He said, fine. I filled out my name and address and kind of what I wanted. And he said, Mr. Bacon, as he called me, Mr. Bacon Sensei. He said, what, you live here? Yeah, right here in Kuroishi. Really, are you alone? I said, no, my wife and 2 children, they're with me. We live here. Really? You live here, your family, in Kuroishi? I thought, either my Japanese is really bad at the moment, or he's really dense. I said, yes, we're here. He said, would you come with me, please? I thought, okay. So I walked upstairs, and ushered me into this room with a lounge, sofa and so forth, and sat down. And then this young woman came in with a tray and had tea and rice crackers, and I thought, I don't know what's going on, but I'm glad for the refreshments. So I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden somebody came in with a camera and said, "Smile, click." I thought, wait a minute, what's going on? And they said, well, it's not only a print shop, but we're the local newspaper. And guess what? You are news. You're the first foreign family that's ever lived in our community that we know of. And would you mind if in the next couple of days we sent out a reporter to interview you to find out more and what you're here for and so forth? I said, well, I'll see if I can work it into my busy schedule. But anyway, so sure enough, he came a couple of days later, and we talked and we shared. And then following shortly afterwards, we got the local newspaper. It's called the Kuroishi Shimbun. And there was a big article with our picture and so forth, with this headline: "Bacon comes to Kuroishi." And it said, here's this very nice young American family, and they're here in our community, and this is wonderful. They're offering to teach conversational English or American cooking classes, and they're here to be, part of our community, and so let's warmly welcome them and take every opportunity to take advantage of their presence with us. Do you think I could have paid for this kind of publicity? God opened a door for the word, and because of that article and that opening, today there's a church in Kuroishi. I just got a lovely thing from the church. It's their 50th anniversary. And we had a very, initial part in laying the foundation. But it was God's provision of his resources in response to the prayers of his people that opened that door for the word. But not only did these people pray, he exhorted them to live lives that consistent with, that gave credibility to their message, and that helped the cause of global evangelization. And they prayed for the spread of the message and its messengers, but they also did something more. And Paul says, I think it necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. See, this church just didn't sit there and smile at a distance and say, keep it up, Paul. They actually took steps to send reinforcements. They sent one of their own, a young man by the name of Epaphroditus. And that was no short trip. There was 800 miles from Philippi to Rome at this time. And Paul was in jail. That wasn't an easy assignment. But he went as a short-term worker, and there played an important part, a contribution. Today there's all kinds of opportunities and global projects and needs. And as I've mentioned before, 1/3 of our world today is still living in places where Christ isn't known and the church isn't near. And how is that going to change? How are these people going to be able to sing our song, Joy to the World, the Lord has come, without someone taking that message? I'm grateful that St. Paul's, as I understand it, in the past has sent short-term missionaries and supported various projects. Your pastor has gone to Africa, I believe, several times, and that's wonderful. But what about next year, post-COVID, hopefully, and beyond that, years to come? The church in Philippi had a vision for the wider world, but do we? Do we see beyond our current commitments and what the missions committee is doing these days, all the projects we're a part of, the way you support and pray for them is wonderful. But I'm sensing that God has something more for us. I'm thinking of that 1/3 of the world that still is waiting for the song. They haven't heard it. They don't know the words. And not only did this church send workers, but also it took practical steps to support and help. And Paul reminds them in chapter 4, he says, yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. I mean, the Apostle Paul was no first century John Wayne. He wasn't this tough guy who just, needed nobody. he could just walk into any situation and, and share the gospel and without fear or worry. No, that's not the Paul we find in the New Testament. He was very much a human like us. He suffered loneliness at times and was desperate for people to come and be with him. He faced fear, like when he was in Corinth. He was trembling. His fear was so great, it said God came to him in a vision at night and said, Paul, I got it under control. Stop being afraid. He suffered from anxiety and worried for this church is falling apart, the church over there, and what's going to happen and so forth. He struggled. He had human needs, just like you and me, just like missionaries today. There are times when Lindy and I were in situations where we were thousands of miles from our kids and home and family, and we have this sort of cynical saying in mission circles, absence makes the heart grow fonder for somebody else. And people would say, oh, sure, we'll pray for you, and God bless you as you go back to the field, and then months go by, years go by, you don't hear a peep from them. I remember coming home after 4 years away, and I bumped into a friend from the church, a guy that I thought I knew fairly well. He said, oh, Dan, it's so good to see you. And I said, yeah, it's nice to be back. And he says, I haven't seen you around much lately. Where have you been? Well, we've been overseas for the last 4 years. Oh, well, that's why I haven't seen you. Here I thought he was connected. He had offered to pray and all the rest when he was gone. Sometimes missionaries feel like they're at the end of a long, slender thread that at any moment somebody can cut and then you just drift off. So it's important to care, to give in tangible ways, to support and help. So partnership is God's ordained way of doing mission. He never intended missions to be a solo effort or the work of just a few super saints. So this Christmas, as we sing or hum or hear, joy to the world, joy to the world. Please voice the words with fresh intention and a fresh commitment and a new willingness to be a part of God's global purpose, to bring the joy of the gospel to those places where Christ is not known and the church is not